Hello, this is Psych. Have you ever seen these dart charts to explain reliability and validity? Well, these charts can be completely misleading. And in fact, one chart is actually just nonsensical. So today I'm going to talk about the relationship between reliability and validity and why it is that one chart in particular is very misleading. So I'm going to begin with the conclusion that's widely accepted among the measurement community, and then we're going to talk about why this is accepted. So the conclusion is that reliability is necessary but insufficient for validity. So as we get started, or before we really get started, let's begin also with a brief explanation of each of these terms. What is reliability? Well, reliability is concerned about the consistency of my scores or observations. What is validity? Validity is concerned with how I interpret the scores. Are my interpretations, let's say, appropriate? It's also concerned with whether I'm justified in using the scores for a particular purpose. Let's begin with a simple example. I like to cook, and it is important that particular foods reach a certain temperature prior to eating. So for chicken must reach 165 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 75 degrees Celsius. So let's say that I'm in the process of cooking my chicken, and unbeknownst to me, my chicken is actually 165 degrees. However, I do not know this, so I want to check it with my thermometer. Well, let's see what would happen under different conditions. So, condition number one, with my first chart, I have no reliability and there's no validity. So, let's say that I've been cooking my chicken for a while, so I want to test it. The thermometer reads 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is freezing. So I'm shocked and I decide to test it again. Now it reads 111 degrees or 111 degrees Fahrenheit. And I repeat this process a few more times and I write down my observations. Here are the results: 33 degrees, 111 degrees, 75, 160, and 121. These observations are unreliable simply because they are all over the place. I could also say that the scores are untrustworthy, they're undependable, and inconsistent. With respect to validity, validity is concerned about the extent to which my interpretation of the scores is, let's say, justified, or if the way that I'm going to use the scores is justified. So why is validity a problem? Well, what do these results mean? And as far as I can tell, they are simply random numbers and do not really mean anything. Also, if I choose to interpret these numbers as a sign of the chicken's temperature, then this is obviously going to be problematic. I'm going to end up with overcooked or undercooked chicken. Situation 2, reliability but no validity. Now let's change the situation a bit. In this case, I can take my first temperature reading, and it's 190. I'm still a bit shocked, so I want to take the temperature a few more times. And here are the results: 190, 191, 192, 189, 191 again. And in this case, my observations are consistent, but there's a tendency for my thermometer to overestimate the temperature of my chicken. So in this case, I can still obtain chicken that's inappropriately cooked due to these systematic differences. The scores are reliable, but I'm still lacking validity with respect to my interpretation. This situation is very common in educational and psychological testing. We often obtain scores that are reliable, but in some sense we're lacking validity. And this can happen in two different ways. First, my scores are reliable, but I misinterpret them. So for example, let's say I'm trying to measure introversion, a personality characteristic. In this case, I could get reliable scores, but I'm actually measuring something else, such as maybe narcissism. Situation 2, my scores are reliable and I interpret them correctly, but I'm using the scores in some kind of, let's say, inappropriate way. So for situation 2, I could interpret the scores, let's say, appropriately, but I'm using it in some way that they shouldn't be used. So perhaps I'm maybe justified in believing that the scores represent introversion, but I'm not justified when I start to use those scores to select people, select who to hire, let's say at my place of employment. Situation 3, we have reliability and validity. This is really our ideal case or our ideal situation. So we have consistent observations, and the evidence indicates that my interpretation and use of the scores are justified. Let's look at the last example. Chart number 4, we have unreliable scores, but they're valid. And this is where we start to run into problems. Many people interpret this chart as unreliable, but valid. And this interpretation is simply incorrect. In fact, this interpretation is so strange to me that it's hard for me to even know what to say about it. As far as I can tell, people say that this is reliable but valid because one observation has hit the mark. However, this chart is really no different from my first chart, in which we had scores that were unreliable and my interpretations and so forth are invalid. So why is this the case? Well, let's go back to our conclusion. Reliability is necessary, but insufficient for validity. So what does this mean? Well, if something is necessary, then it must occur for the other condition to happen. In other words, I can have reliability without validity, but I cannot have validity without reliability. So let's look at maybe a more simple example to see how this could work. We could say that water is necessary but insufficient for carrots to grow. In other words, in order for carrots to grow, I have to have water. However, there's other things that I also need to obtain carrots, such as fertile soil and maybe a specific climate and so forth. This is the same thing with reliability, or same kind of situation with reliability and validity. In order to measure something, I have to have consistency in my scores. If I have no reliability, then nothing is being measured.